All right, Matej is ready, and it looks like he's been doing some more light magic. Let's give it up for him.
Yeah, so I've been working on the art curriculum for the indie game development school here. We're going to start Spelkollektivet, and it's the same. The art curriculum is also used in my game Pixel Art Academy. So it's developed for both of the things. And right now I was working on explaining colors. And so with all of these things that I try to teach, I try to make sure that I understand them in depth before that. And so I was trying to make a diagram of all the different things that give objects their colors. And some of you might remember this kind of graphs I already showed. I had done some experiments. So usually you would hear what usually gives things color. For example, this green screen behind me, which I guess people on the stream can't see, but you can trust me, there's green screen. It's green because like light is an electromagnetic radiation that has all this white light from those lights, has all the different wavelengths like red, green, and blue. And when it hits the green screen, it sucks in the red and the blue wavelengths, and it just reflects the green one, and this green one comes into our eyes, and that's why we see the green screen that is green. And so, yeah, so that's one example. And so I've showed this already before. So for example, here is a graph for gold. Why gold looks like gold? Because here is a graph of how much it reflects different wavelengths. So for the blue ones, it only reflects like 50%, and the other 50% gets sucked in. Whereas on the reds and yellows, it reflects almost all of them. And I also have this graph little here. Dispersion takes about 5 to 10 seconds to render because it's just in JavaScript. And you'll see this small image down here actually describes what I kind of said here. So yeah, here's the incoming light ray, and then when it hits the gold surface, it gets split into a refracted ray that goes into the surface and the reflected ray of one color. And you can see gold gets what we see, and what goes in is this kind of blue color here. And if you don't trust me, and if you haven't seen my talks yet, here are two photos from the Hanover University of how gold foil looks like on the front side. And then if you light it from the back, you would actually see the blue light coming through. But this happens since like the blue light gets absorbed so quickly that you really need a thin foil of. And you can see here I even have this depth. So you see that in 90, 100 nanometers, it just kind of blocks in. But the thing that I wasn't happy about this graph is how long it takes to render. So I did a passion project over the weekend to create a real-time implementation of this. So here's my new scattering simulation. Has a little bit more knobs and everything. And yeah, and it runs on the GPU, so it calculates this stuff in real time. It's PBR, so, and in high dynamic range, so I have this exposure value, so you can see that those colors are still there. But yeah, if I overexpose it, then even the reflected color looks white, even though it's, as you can see, it's that golden thing that we talked about. So yeah, this is pretty neat. I always like spectrums. And yeah, and now when I switch, it doesn't take super long. So for example, copper is kind of the same thing, the same reason why it looks this kind of reddish color and stuff like that. So by this logic, for something to be white, it basically needs to reflect all the light equally. And you would then, like people would give you an example, it's a white piece of paper. It's white because it reflects all of the wavelengths back. However, and so to test this, here I have material cellulose. Cellulose is what is this organic material. You can see here's the formula. That paper is pretty much made out of just cellulose. So let's see what happens when we hit cellulose with a light ray. And it actually, most of it just goes in into the material. And this doesn't mean like in the gold's case, when some of it goes in and then it gets absorbed super fast. If on this graph I choose cellulose and then wait these 10 seconds, you can see that like here it actually just goes through, and even as I go deeper in, the color doesn't change. It just keeps on going through. And in fact, cellulose is pretty much like glass. If I give you a bunch of cellulose, normal, a cube of 100% cellulose, it would look like a piece of glass. So obviously, white color of paper doesn't come from this, oh, all the light reflects, at least not in this kind of way as it does for metals or materials that conduct electricity. And so, yeah, it has something to do with reflection. And so if you look at these kind of articles on the internet that teach you about different types of reflection, here's one from the physics classroom. Something like this is what I would usually come across. And it gives you this explanation here. So what I kind of said, the rays reflect depending on this, how the surface is angled. However, here we have some piece of paper. It says most of the things in life don't actually have these smooth surfaces, but are rough. And so here's a macroscopic picture of paper, how it looks like. It's very rough. And so here they give this then explanation that, okay, so when we have rough surfaces, the light rays, instead of going back nicely in nice parallel lines, they just get scattered in all directions or diffused. And then they show you that, oh, well, why that happens is, yeah, because they still reflect like on a mirror, but because the surface is rough, this angle, the surface itself angles so differently, and so all of these rays get reflected this much. So, okay, cool. So in my little editor, I created the possibility to change the surface here. So let me see if this works. So I just created this kind of a bumpy surface. It's not super real time because it's, creating all the textures in the background. But yeah, so if I change now, you see if I go around, when I'm hitting, let me put it a little bit more here. So it's just gonna be a little bit more obvious. Just gonna bounce it up. Now it's very irregular. But yeah, as soon as you see here at like the kind of the reflected ray, actually, let me make it bigger so you'll see. I mean, yeah, basically the reflected ray is still not happening. And let me just find this image here that I have. Just so that it's a little bit more obvious. This down, put this in. So this would be, I was thinking, okay, so this is now a picture of paper because it has this rough surface, and I'm gonna just make this beam a little bit wider. And I also have this schematic view that I can turn on. So this is basically what that page was saying should happen with paper, but it's actually not happening. Most of the light just goes through because, well, it's still transparent. There is some light that is bouncing up. If I really crank up the exposure, you can see that some light is, of course, now bouncing up more, but most of it still goes through. And so this means that when you look at paper, still it would look kind of like glass. It's actually kind of like frosted glass. It has a rough surface, but it's still glass. It blurs the reflection, but you still see through it. So this also can't be why paper is white. And so there's another kind of diffuse reflection that this article, the first one, didn't talk about. And if we go on Wikipedia about diffuse reflection, they actually give you a different kind of picture when they're explaining stuff. And they talk about here that, yeah, most of the diffuse reflection doesn't happen from surface roughness, but actually from what happens underneath the surface. So I call this kind of subsurface reflection or subsurface scattering or diffuse light. It comes in different names. And to realize why this happens is that, yeah, if we look at paper again at a microscopic level, and I love this scanning electron images, you can see that this is the top one is a paper cut with scissors, the bottom one is the paper torn with a hand. You can see there's all these fibers that are creating paper. If you look more for research papers, there's one that even gives you a complete cross section of a normal office piece of paper here. So I just took that image. Wow, I'm getting some weird stuff, but I think it's gonna work anyway. Oh yeah, copy image address. I think this is should work fine. So here we go. Here we now have the the thing that's actually happening. And so let me turn down the schematic view and go with, so basically every light ray, and I'm gonna put this down because it works slow, and I'm gonna crank up the number of scattering events I'm calculating. So when I go around, you can see that every ray goes inside and just very chaotically scrambles along all of these rays. At each of the surface, it turns like it would normally, like off of a mirror or into a glass, but because it's so irregular, most of them actually just come back out. Some make it through, but most of them actually come back out. So yeah, when we look at this back here, I'm gonna crank this a little bit more up, but my computer is a bit slow. So, but basically you can see that, yeah, when, if I let it render for a little bit, most of the light actually gets reflected back up. And it also gets reflected, because it's so chaotic underneath, it gets reflected in all angles pretty much very uniformly. And that's what makes paper white. So yeah, you see that. And of course, light also goes through, which you can know if you look at the paper towards the light. You can see that it's translucent. The deeper it would be, the less it would actually be translucent. So yeah, and the picture I showed you previously, the one that didn't have air in it, that's actually tracing paper. They make tracing paper simply by smashing the cellulose into so much that it becomes this gelatinous mass that just doesn't have air. Or another alternative way to make tracing paper is to take normal paper and use some other material that has a similar index of refraction as paper, and they let it into the paper. I think I looked at how to make tracing paper, just quick Google, and it was like, yeah, take oil all over and let it dry overnight, and yeah, then the oil gets into the paper. So all of these gaps are filled out, and it basically becomes optically the same. So there's no this change in underneath. And there's a third option, which is this one here. In this one, and let's turn this on for a moment because you'll see better. In this one, only the top surface of the paper, you take normal paper, you just put polymers on top of the surface to create a coating. So this is coated paper or glossy paper. And when you look at it like this, let me crank this back down so I can do this more real time. And then exposure down. You can see that on glossy paper, there is still a very strong specular or mirror-like reflection, but because of the surface underneath, it still reflects most of the light back up into all directions. So you have this combination of white paper with a little bit of a shiny surface. It works kind of like a mirror a little bit. So yeah, and so that's why, so now I had a kind of a final vision of different kind of surfaces. And usually when we talk about, when you're gonna look at 3D materials, we have this surface roughness map that controls how much it's, how flat or rough, bumpy the surface is. Then we have the metallic maps, which explains the difference between why gold gets color and why other things get color, which I'll talk some other day. But we also should have this slider between what kind of a subsurface structure is. And so it goes from completely uniform and then to completely heterogeneous. I have no idea. But yeah, so basically, and the way to think about this dimension is that on top, and this is only for non-conductive materials, on top they're pretty transparent, and then the more you go down, the more opaque, less transparent they get, and the more white they become, because they scatter all of the light, whatever you hit it with, back up. So yeah, that's kind of here's the graph of all these things together. Yeah, that's it. Any questions?
I'm actually trying to write something really similar, so this is great to give this talk. For optimizing glossy surfaces, can you split that really evenly into a reflective component, a specular one, and a diffuse component? Or does the diffuse component have some properties inherent to the incidence angle?
Sorry, what the incidence angle?
So would the incidence angle of light change the diffuse part of a specular or of a glossy surface, or can you split apart the specular?
You definitely can split them apart, and the way you would also then render is you would separately consider the specular contribution based on the surface roughness, and that would be one part of the render, which you would usually have like an environment probe, because it has to have kind of reflections. And then for the diffuse part, you would just look at normally how light, so either the HDR directly of the probe around it or actual light sources. And they do affect, like the light angle does affect diffuse light as well, because at what kind of angle it is coming down at, the cosine of these two angles, that still holds. But yeah, usually you would split it into these two components, and you can do one part of calculations for the diffuse part, and then another part of the calculation for the specular reflection. Not sure if this answers.
Totally does.
Okay.
I was just going to say, this was an excellent, little presentation about light reflection and diffusion. Have you ever considered becoming a teacher?
No, not at all. But yeah, I will try to, as Annie also pointed out, it's like, yeah, here I wrote an article about it on Patreon where you can read this and digest in a little bit slower. At the very end, I do also include, because eventually I want to use this knowledge. Sure, I like it as a science nerd, but eventually I also want to use this knowledge for how making better art, basically. So I do want to teach art with this as well. And the takeaway from this is, the main one, at least for me, is that most of the stuff, or way more than what we think about stuff, is transparent and translucent. And after doing all of this, I went down the route through the forest, and I was looking at flower petals towards the light, and looking at how can we render this? Why don't we? Because subsurface scattering shaders are becoming more common, but not as much as I would like, I think. And it was actually one of the interesting things for me was that you don't necessarily, because what usually, if I went into Blender, this up and down thing, it would be kind of approximated with the alpha channel that goes from transparent to, but as soon as you make something transparent in kind of conventional 3D ways now, that's kind of like you would make it transparent in Photoshop, so you have it at 50%, and then that means that you can see 50% of the background, which then also means that because it's a transparent material, you need to render it separately than from opaque materials. Usually we render opaque materials or opaque objects from front to back, so that the ones in front that cover most of the stuff prevent us to see stuff from behind, and we can save on rendering times. You can't do that with, for example, glass, because you see through glass and you have to render the background first. So for transparent objects, we render them from back to front. But the thing about this is, like a flower petal, when you look at it, or a leaf, it's not actually transparent in that way that, let's say that, because it's transparent, that I moved my hand behind it, you would actually see any difference. Not at all. Like I was looking at that's literally, people must have, there was nobody on the road, but I was literally like looking at light, and if I put my arm in, you don't actually see the difference. The only difference you see is when you actually block the light source, and it basically casts a shadow on it. So basically, what I want to do for my own shaders, because I am developing, I'm trying to, with the fruits and all of that, I am trying to make my own shaders that are going to capture this more accurately than what's built in what the PBR shader that's built into 3JS does. The way I think I could approximate this is with a sort of, you both need, so yes, you need this subsurface structure slider, but basically, and then plus this, you also need a thickness map. And I don't know how much, if we actually, there's somebody else that does PBR materials in modern engines, I'm not sure if we have a thickness map yet. Because basically, for a leaf, you would just have to have a double-sided material, and then from the thickness map, you can because usually if a leaf, you're looking at it from its backside, from the shadow side, you just say, oh, this light cannot hit it, like it's on the shadow side, and you don't do any contributions from lights that are on the opposite side. However, with this, you would actually have to. So instead of just cutting out all the lights that are coming from the opposite sides, you do account for them, but just diminish their value based on the depth. So you could, if you had leaves and a depth map, you could actually calculate that fairly cheaply, I think, and it would make for some good renders, I hope. And I think this is how, like, if you have leaf shaders specifically, would have this kind of subsurface scattering simulated. But I think we could just apply it on everything for free. I mean, very free. Anyway, sorry, this was a very different question. Do you want to be a teacher?
No, beautiful. I'm sucked in by your teacher voice.
But yes. All right, thank you.
Woohoo!